Welcome to this sermon for Palm Sunday. I wonder what you think someone from Jesus' time would think if they entered one of our churches and saw a crucifix on the wall. And what would they think if someone told them that they were in a place of worship and in the middle of a religious ceremony? They'd probably think we'd lost our minds. The image of the crucifixion was one of the most frightening images in the Roman world. It was an image of unimaginable suffering, humiliation and pain, literally excruciating, from the Latin ex crucis, meaning out of the cross. It was an instrument of terror that the Romans used against subjugated populations. Many of you will have seen the film Spartacus, where the survivors of the slave revolt against the Roman Republic are crucified along the road, both as punishment for rebellion and to serve as a warning to the local population. And that scene isn't just an exaggeration for the big screen, it's true. Crassus, the Roman general, sentenced 6,000 people to be crucified along the Appian Way, across every 35 yards for 120 miles from Capua to Rome. It was a terrifying symbol. How bizarre then to a first century person under Roman rule that such a depiction should be the sign of the greatest and largest world religion, a symbol of victory. I wonder how we'd feel if we came across a religion which used the electric chair or the hangman's noose as its symbol. We'd probably think it was weird, if not sick. But a symbol of triumph it is, and that in itself tells us a great deal about the identity of Jesus Christ, a man who was able to take something like the cross, a symbol of death, and transform it into a symbol of hope. He is a redeemer by his very nature, drawing to himself that which is evil in order to transform it into something good. That's what he did on the cross, which serves as a symbol of the deeper reality that he does it for our sins, drawing them away from us, taking them onto himself, redeeming them and redeeming us through love and obedience to the Father. In our long reading from Matthew's Gospel, we encounter all the forms of human dysfunction that are touched by the story of Jesus' passion. First, we have Judas's betrayal. For just a few miserable pieces of silver, Judas betrays his friend and master, not for a cause, not for another person, but simply for the gain of money. Sordid betrayal. In Dante's Divine Comedy, betrayal is portrayed as the greatest of sins, and the lowest places in hell, the inferno, are reserved for traitors, betrayers and oath-breakers such as Judas Iscariot. After supper with his disciples, in which Jesus has laid down his life willingly in the breaking of bread and the offering of wine, we're transported to the Garden of Gethsemane. Here, while Jesus prays with such intensity and love for his church that he sweats blood and weeps, his disciples are asleep. Indifference. Another sin at work in this story. Indifference, a don't care attitude, is one of the most pernicious afflictions of the soul, and one which is feeding on millions of souls today. I know your works, says the angel to the church in Laodicea. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. Indifference. And as Jesus prays in the garden, his accusers come bearing swords and spears, flexing their muscles and earthly power. We encounter the sin of violence in these men. Violence even against he who was all innocence and compassion. And even Peter colludes with this violence, cutting off the ear of the high priest's slave. And what an appropriate image. Violence cutting off the means of listening, understanding, and reconciliation. We see violence being brought upon Jesus. And after the violence in the garden, the disciples fled. They who had insisted they'd always stand by Jesus, come what may, even to death, took fright and fled. Spiritual cowardice. Another sin touched on by this story. We all know that phrase, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. And here it's exemplified in the moral cowardice of the disciples, who see the light of the world in front of them, who know the right path, but who can't muster the courage to follow it. How much do we feel that same shame that they did when we do or say nothing when the right course demands otherwise? Jesus is then brought before the Sanhedrin to account for his crimes, and they bring false witnesses to testify against him. Both the scribes and Pharisees and the false witnesses are people who care more for gain than for truth, for preserving their status or receiving a bribe more than seeing justice done. In the Old Testament, the prophet Daniel has a vision of the destruction of Satan and the defeat of hell. And amid this scene of destruction, he says, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." And for the first time, to those who are bent on putting Jesus to death, he reveals himself to them as the one of whom Daniel had spoken. Jesus says, "Hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And at these words, all hell breaks loose. In the midst of liars, the truth is proclaimed. And having been condemned by the council of elders, we meet Peter in the outer yard and hear his threefold denial, his further betrayal. But at the same time, St. Matthew takes us back to Judas, and here we're given a very important lesson in the potential of forgiveness and reconciliation. Whereas Peter seeks forgiveness, Judas sinks into despair. He can't believe in forgiveness. He's blind to the reconciliation that Jesus has come to bring between God and man, even for the likes of him. Despair turns to destruction, and Judas self-destructs. Hopelessness and faithlessness, another sin that's brought into Christ's passion. And finally, we have Pontius Pilate, a man who knows he's looking on someone who's done no wrong, but caves in to the baying mob nonetheless. He convicts an innocent man and condemns him to the most agonizing torture and death. Abuse of power, another face of sin that plays its part in the final moments of Jesus' life. So let's go back and think about those faces of sin which Jesus encounters on his way to the cross. Betrayal, indifference, violence, cowardice, deceit, faithlessness, and abuse of power. Jesus encounters all these sins on his way to Calvary. And on his way to the cross, he absorbs them. He takes them upon himself and nails those very sins to the cross. He journeys into the darkness of sin and sheds on it the light of his truth, love, and mercy. That's the good news in the terrible story of his passion. And over this coming week, we'll see all that he's done to bring his light into the darkness and evil that surround our lives, giving us the sacrament of his body and blood on Maundy Thursday, sacrificing himself on the cross on Good Friday, and rising again to new life on Easter Day. There's nothing more important than this. Make sure you join us on those 3 holy days, and amid the darkness that's so obvious in the world today, as we see the ravages of COVID-19 and the death and destruction it's reaping in our world, make sure the light of Christ burns brightly in your heart this Easter. Amen.